We have with us today a very knowledgeable guest. We have P.D. Newman, who wrote Alchemically Stoned, The Psychedelic Secrets of Freemasonry, and other incredibly fascinating books on esoterica and entheogens. He came very highly recommended by Vancouver's own entheogenic historian, Chris Bennett, the author of Liber 420. And I'm very excited for the subjects we're going to get into today, where we are going to take this conversation not only into the area of how psychedelic mushrooms that contain psilocybin and DMT, or when we look over at cannabis and hashish, have influenced mysticism, metaphysics, and the occult, but we're also going to get into theurgy and concepts that the Neoplatonists had about various exits and entrances when you're being born into this world. All kinds of incredible topics. Daniel, how are you doing?
I'm fantastic, Johnny. How are you?
I'm doing great. The fact that we have you on the show, I'm very excited about all these subjects we're going to get into. I thought first, let's get into Saint Germain. Let's talk about the Theosophical Society and the I Am movement. What can you tell us about how those movements may have been influenced by entheogens?
Well, Saint Germain, in particular, the way he plays into my research isn't directly. I'm more concerned with Cagliostro, but Saint Germain plays into this because Cagliostro left an alchemical text that kind of details his approach to alchemy, which was an entheogenic or psychedelic approach to alchemy. And this text was found in his possession when he was arrested by the Inquisition. But for some reason, someone who had it in their possession after this event penciled in on the front page Saint Germain, which was just a guess on their part as to who could have possibly written this. But if you look at the evidence and compare what's in the book to Cagliostro's own, what he calls his Egyptian rite of Freemasonry, it becomes blatantly clear that this is Cagliostro's system. It's exactly the same system he presents. So that's how Saint Germain plays into that. But you mentioned the Theosophical Society. Now, I mentioned in my second book, Angels in Vermilion, that the Theosophical Society in the earliest days, there's evidence in the letters and in the proceedings that it was an attempt to continue what was stopped when Cagliostro was arrested during the Inquisition. So they're trying to, in a sense, bring back this system. Well, it doesn't appear that they did whenever you look at the Theosophical Society that we've come to know today. But as John Patrick Davini points out in his book, and excuse me, his paper, The Two Theosophical Societies, there are actually two Theosophical Societies. It's the same organization, but they changed their model after one event in particular that almost shut them down. But what happened was, at the first meeting in New York, where they decided we're going to form this society, we're going to call it the Theosophical Society. What they decided was they were going to practice magic. This was going to be an order based on practical approaches to magic, not theoretical approaches, philosophical explorations. And they actually had a textbook. If you read in Colonel Olcott's diaries, Old Leaves, he says that they had a textbook, and it was a book by a woman named Emma Hardinge or Harding. It's Hardinge, Britton, Britten. And it was actually published under her husband's name because of, at the time, it was just easier to get things done in men's names, I think. But she wrote it. We know that she was the author. And in this book, it details everything that we have come to be familiar with about magic. She got a lot of it from people you'd be familiar with, like Eliphas Levi, mainly her elemental stuff. But she also has things in there that you can't find anywhere else, like discussions on using hallucinogenic mushrooms to induce a state of trance wherein you can communicate with what she calls the hierarchies, the spiritual hierarchies. And at the time she wrote this, which I believe was in the 1850s, 1860s, we knew of at least one hallucinogenic mushroom, which was the Amanita muscaria, or fly agaric mushroom, the famous Alice in Wonderland or Mario mushroom. But she goes so far as to name, she doesn't name them, but she says 2 or 3 species, the acrid distillations of 2 or 3 species of fungus, she says, is what she uses to induce this trance condition, in addition to things like she mentions opium and hashish and lots of other things. But this is significant in the early days of the Theosophical Society because they wanted a demonstration. The members said, well, if we have access to practical magical teachings and we can do these things, well, let's see it. And the vice president, I believe he was the vice president, George Felt, F-E-L-T. He was a chemist, and so he had knowledge of drugs, of chemicals at least. But what he was studying at the time were Egyptian zodiacs. So I'm guessing he's studying the Dendera zodiac,
yeah,
probably studying the Deccan systems, right? And he's got these things drawn out on big sheets of paper, or boards or something. And he says while he was studying them and reading the names and things on them aloud, he noticed that his pets, he had a dog and a cat, both of them were acting strange, like there was something else in the room. And he says if it had just been the cat, he wouldn't have thought twice about it, because cats do that. But both the dog and the cat were responding to this. And so he thought, wow, well, they must be able to see something. How can I make these visible for everyone to see? And that's when he comes up with this experiment he's going to do, to show everyone present that spirits, these elemental spirits, are real and that you can conjure them to visual appearance. And what he proceeds to do is burn an unspecified substance on a charcoal. And once the smoke filled the room, absolute panic broke out, because everybody there claimed to be able to see these demonic entities present that they compared to the figures from Francis Barrett's The Magus, if you've seen those drawings in The Magus, which are very similar to the drawings you'll see in the Goetia, the Goetic demons, sort of anthropoidal kind of beast men, demonic looking, scary, frightening looking, menacing appearance with menacing faces. And all of them saw this. And it scared everyone so much that Felt disappeared. He never came back. So, and this upset Alcott, because he said, the whole point was to do this practical stuff. And now that he's gone and he's the only one that could do the practical stuff, now we're just left with a bunch of scared members. And we've got this textbook, but now everybody's afraid to use it. So they basically said at this point, we'll keep the Theosophical Society going, but from here on out, we're not going to do any more of this practical exploration. We know it's real. We got the proof we need. We don't even need to do that stuff anymore. We'll just act as if that's true and proceed accordingly. And that's what Davini calls the Second Theosophical Society, which changed considerably, but you still have evidence in the literature pointing back to the use of hallucinogens, at least knowledge of them. When she talks about, for example, I believe it's in the Anthropogenesis volume of the Secret Doctrine, she's talking about soma, which we know, scholars have known forever, that soma is a drug. It's worshipped as a god, but it's also a drug. But she's clearly discussing it not just in terms of a drug, but she says it liberates the astral body from the physical body and allows you to travel through these heavenly planes, so that when you come back to your body, it has the virtue of allowing you to retain in your memory all these travels, which under normal circumstances you would have forgotten. And there's, probably 5-10 reports from close friends of hers who claim that when she would have these types of experiences, that she would use hashish and to induce them. And if you're familiar with the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, which the Theosophical Society actually shut down because they were threatening them. When after the Theosophical Society says no more practical work, let's go theoretical. Well, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor pops up and they said, well, we can fill that hole. So let's just teach the practical stuff. And so they offer to teach practical sex magic, mirror gazing, and central to everything was hashish, but they called it soma. Just like Blavatsky was talking about. She doesn't say it's hashish, but it's likely it's all the same crowd. For instance, one of their members, who was a member of the Theosophical Society, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and an alchemist named Reverend Ayton, William Alexander Ayton, I believe was his name. But there's an extant letter from him to a student, a neophyte in America, asking him to explain his initiation he went through into the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. And he says, well, it was an astral initiation. They sent me a vial in the mail of something they purported to be the true soma. And he says, I had a suspicion of what I thought it was based on how it smelled, and me being a doctor, I've been around drugs my whole life. I know drugs, he says. But he says, after I took it, I took my heart rate, and I think he says it was accelerated, which let him know it was the drug he thought that it was. He doesn't say cannabis, but he's saying it's a drug. And he says, I never hallucinated or saw anything, but I felt the presence of the astral masters there in the room with me for 3 hours. I think he says something like that.
And I want to jump in there for a second, because when we go back to Saint Germain's writings, let's say the most holy Trina Sophia, and we see
that's the one I'm saying is Cagliostro's.
Right. And there's an interesting connection there, because if you go look at section 5 and you read that, he talks about leaving his body and going into the heavens, and he's looking down, he's seeing globes below his feet. And it's very interesting because there is a theosophical theory that comes back to Francis Utney, where he believed that Saint Germain was not only connected to various peoples like the Hungarian prince Rákóczi, and then we connect him over, of course, to Francis Bacon in 1625. We had Rákóczi would have been 1735. We had Saint Germain in 1784, but then we bring that down into this connection with Memphis Mizraim, Egyptian Masonry with Cagliostro, like you're saying. And there's this pattern that we see also when we look at the Rosicrucians and the Invisible College, that there is this other place that you're meeting up in these initiations. We find that in the Golden Dawn and these areas. Are you suggesting that psilocybin or entheogens could have been part of that connection to getting there as a shortcut?
It definitely was in the case of Cagliostro. and it goes back a lot further than Cagliostro. But if you look at his system of initiation, central to it is this red elixir, this thing he calls, it's a red liqueur that is placed on the master's altar, and the candidate for initiation has to drink this substance. And he says, drink it, so, and he says, so that you can understand the following speech, which I'm about to announce to you. And he says that its taste is pleasant, and it won't be unpleasant, basically encouraging him to drink all of this stuff. And then he starts giving him a lecture about the Garden of Eden and about the tree of life, and how the tree of life was given to Adam, but he abused it and lost it. And it says that, but it remained in the hands of the elect of God, he says, and him talking about his own group of people who still have this knowledge. And he says, and now this is how you get your hands back on it, through this system, basically through Masonry, through reintegrating yourself back into God's plan, get back into Eden and get access to this tree of life. And then he says that the acacia, which you're exposed to in the ordinary degree of Master Mason, is nothing but that red liqueur that you just drank. So he tells him that you're drinking acacia. Now, in Le Très Sainte Trina Sophie, let me grab this book. 1 second. I've got it right here, so I don't have to go far. But in Latreia Sancta Trino Sophie, I don't know if you'll be able to see these pictures. This is in my book, Angels in Vermilion. Let's see.
Maybe hold it up a little closer for us, if you could.
Can you see the
there
bird
we are.
there?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, we can see it. We can make it out.
The bird has a sprig of acacia in its mouth, and
Right.
we know it's a sprig of acacia because it has the same bipinnate compound leaf structure that's common to most mimosoids like acacia, mimosa, vachellia, and adenanthera.
When you look at the constituents that when ayahuasca is being brewed, when we look at DMT, dimethyltryptamine, or NN-DMT, there we find the ingredients, right?
That's right. Well, acacia isn't normally used, to our knowledge, in anywhere as a psychedelic in this way. There's examples of it being drunk in South America, but not paired with the monoamine oxidase inhibitor. We do get that in the Amazon with ayahuasca, where they pair plants like Psychotria viridis or Diplopteris cabrerana, both of which contain NN-dimethyltryptamine. They'll pair that with another plant called Banisteriopsis caapi.
So the metabolizing will be
that makes so we have a chemical in our gut called monoamine oxidase that if we consume DMT normally, it burns it up and it never makes it into our bloodstream, never passes the blood-brain barrier. We never get that experience. But if we consume with it or prior to taking the DMT a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, what's called an MAOI, which is commonly used in psychiatry to treat bipolar, then it renders it orally active, and it gives that makes it so the substance can get into your body. So yeah, it's normally paired with two plants, and this gets especially interesting with the Cagliostro story too, because, like I said, he's got you drinking this thing. He says it's acacia. And then in this book that is disputed who wrote it, Saint Germain or Cagliostro. Well, in it, we have this bird with this acacia in his beak. And in the same section, I believe it's section 6, is where he is given a shining crystal cup with a liqueur in it of saffron hue. And he's told to drink it all, that it will increase his intelligence and make him braver and stronger so that he can finish his journey. Very similar to what Cagliostro tells the candidate in the ritual. And that's the main evidence for this. That's what really clued me into the fact that the acacia was more than just a symbol, at least in some cases. At the time, I couldn't say it, in the beginning, this is what it was, but here it is certainly the case with Cagliostro. And it gets interesting because we haven't mentioned an MAOI, right? We've only mentioned acacia. It's not supposed to be just orally active that way. Well, fast forward 100 years, and we've got a group of Rosicrucians, very famous Rosicrucians, that are mirror gazing and using hashish in an attempt to contact spirits, to get wisdom they can't get on the earthly plane. Now, these men are first mentioned, when I first found them, was in a paper by John Yarker. I'm sure you're familiar with John Yarker, famous in the Memphis Mizraim section of occultism, has a history in OTO for contact with Crowley, early OTO. Yarker says that he only ever met 3 men who were competent at all in Rosicrucianism. And in that same paper, he names the 3 things that every true Rosicrucian knows about. In those 3 things, he names mirror gazing or crystal gazing. The 3 persons he names happen to be 3 avid crystal gazers. And these are Frederick Hockley, Kenneth R.H. Mackenzie, and Captain F.G. Irwin. Hockley is very famous. He was a bookseller. He was famous for copying alchemical manuscripts and grimoires. But the woman I mentioned earlier, Emma Hardinge Britton, that wrote that textbook, she was his seer as a virgin girl, as a child. And she wrote about her experience with him in this book called Ghostland, where these two groups of warring mystics were using children as their scryers to get into the spirit world. And she was his seer. But he also has other students as men. These students are Kenneth R.H. Mackenzie, and he's famous for having written the very first Masonic encyclopedia called the Royal Masonic Cyclopedia. And this plays into what I'm going to say in a second. And then Captain F.G. Irwin, who had a son named Herbert Irwin, who was too young to be a Mason, but he was still a virgin and acted as the seer for these gentlemen in their sessions. Now, sadly, he would eventually overdose on laudanum, which is opium, and wine while scrying, because they were using drugs to scry. And he took so much in an attempt to contact a spirit, he died. And F.G. Irwin would spend the rest of his life trying to contact his son in the same way, but wasn't able to because he couldn't do it. Only his son can do it. Kind of like Dee and Kelley, which we might get to later.
The one thing that comes to mind with this also is China's super psychics. Did you ever hear about that with Paul Dong and Thomas E. Raphael, how they were using these children to be spies and using them almost like Dr. Hal Puthoff did at SRI with different remote viewing experiments. But with
that's exactly the kind of thing that sounds like, yeah.
Okay.
Yes. We'll get to that in just 1 second. Let me finish this bit about Irwin because it fills in this MAOI problem. The MAOI that is traditionally used in current days, because it's the most potent MAOI in nature, is Paganum harmalices, which is also known as Syrian rue. They didn't used to call it Syrian rue. They used to call it wild rue or savage rue. And you can read in Pliny the Elder where he says, they're actually the same thing. One's just cultivated and the other one's not. They're not the same thing, but they thought it was back then. Well, rue, the common rue, is very common. It's used in the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church as it's used to throw holy water often, and it really was back in those days, less so now. But Kenneth R.H. Mackenzie is trying to write this Masonic encyclopedia, and he wants an entry on the Fratres Lucis, which is a splinter group that broke away from the very first organization to surface after the first publication of the Rosicrucian manifestos, this order called Der Orden des Gold und Rosen Cruiser, or the Gold and Rosy Cross. So Fratres Lucis was a splinter group that broke away from this, and he wants information on them so he can make an entry on them in his encyclopedia. Well, they don't know anybody that was ever a member, but they have reason to believe Cagliostro was a member, who's dead now for 100 years. So they get Herbert to take some laudanum, eat some hashish, and they get in front of the mirror and he contacts Cagliostro. The spirit shows up and he tells him, we're trying to put together the Fratres Lucis, but we can't. We need more information on it. And Cagliostro says, well, the first thing you're going to have is you're going to have to get the pharmacopoeia down. He said, you're missing something. And they're like, what do we need? He says, you're missing the herb rue. You don't have the herb rue. And they say, well, what is herb rue? And Cagliostro says, well, go find out. You're going to have to find that herb, or you're not going to be able to go any further with what we're talking about. In a letter to Hockley, we don't know what the herb rue was, but in a letter to Hockley, we know it's more than an herb, because Hockley is saying to them, now I read the Cagliostro transmissions where he mentions the herb rue. I've already asked you for this recipe and you haven't sent it to me. I don't know why it's so difficult for you to send me this recipe. If it was one herb, you'd think he'd say, send me the ID of the herb. But he's saying, send me this recipe. And lo and behold, herb rue, wild rue, Syrian rue, savage rue is the thing missing for making basically the Middle Eastern version of ayahuasca if it's combined with acacia. I don't know if you're familiar with Benny Shannon's paper on biblical hallucinogens in the Bible, where he talks about the very real probability that acacia was being combined with Syrian rue in the Middle East to produce something chemically indistinguishable from ayahuasca.
This is fascinating, and I want to pause right there for a moment before we go down this rabbit hole. And I do want you to come back to this and get back into John Dee and Edward Kelley and the scrying they were doing, which was very similar. But also, let's go look at the acacia for a moment in the mysteries. I truly believe there's a difference between the symbolism that we find, although there's a similar connection. But when we go back into, let's say, the Phrygians, we have Attis. And Attis is killed, his blood trickles down into the sprig of an acacia or a sprig of an evergreen or whatever grows up there. And we find this in the Masonic allegories with Hiram Abiff, the widow's son. He's accosted by the three ruffians, Jubala, Jubalo, and Jubalum, at the brow of Mount Moriah. His blood trickles down and a sprig of an evergreen grows there. In acacia. Well, here's the thing about this, though. This is the interesting part I find really fascinating about this, is that this is almost interchangeable, because I would say this is where the story of the Christmas tree comes from, with the Jesse trees in the Bible as well that come up, and we have the 3 days and the days of Advent and Mary Magdalene coming to the sepulchre, just like the story of Osiris. Now, this is what I want to bring up with you about why this gets interchanged. So if we go into Egypt, there's so much, as you're talking, I would love to say about that, because in Egypt we find depictions of what looks like mushrooms, and I believe they knew about mushrooms, and we see them right next to Blue Lotus. We see them next to many connections there that I find fascinating, and I think Dennis McKenna and others have pointed that out before as well. But when we look at that with the story of Osiris, very differently, we see the tamarisk is mentioned. Now, the tamarisk, what I find very, very interesting, and our mutual friend Timothy Hogan has talked about this, and he's got many books out on alchemy and everything else. He's got Element of Elements and all this. He's lectured on this at the Getty Museum, that thorny plant that you see, which is the tamarisk, you can get hydrofluoric acid. As he said, you could use that to eat through granite and make hieroglyphics. He's talked about that at the Getty Museum. You can extract DMT from that. You can extract the what we call these monoatomic elements, like the materials that we would say are a white powder of gold. You can extract all these various things, but as you mentioned, there are other connections to this in the stories. If you go to a Masonic funeral today, and I was at one not too long ago for my uncle, and when I was there, everybody is symbolically leaving like a piece of pine tree or something there to symbolize this, or whatever they can get access to nearby that looks like the evergreen. And originally in the Masonic story, it wasn't the acacia that was added in. Can you tell us a little backstory about how that happened?
I'm glad you asked, because that's really central to this whole problem. In the earliest days of Freemasonry, and you can find this out by looking at any expose, there are many that exist. Look at the oldest ones. You won't find any mention of acacia. Every single one mentions a sprig of cassia. Cassia is it's like cinnamon. It grows in southern China. I get the name mixed up because I wrote it wrong one day, and I'm cursed with a photographic memory.
You have a brilliant memory, man. A brilliant memory.
And I see that name and I know it's wrong. It's either Cinnamonum cassia or Cassia cinnamonum or something like that. But it's a different plant. Now, it's been argued that cassia is just a phonetic anagram of acacia, and they were talking about the same thing.
But here's the thing. According to Timothy,
though,
you can get mercury from it, though. So they may have thought, hey, there's an alchemical connection somewhere down the line. But I agree with you. Acacia, I mean, there's much more you can get mercury from. When you go back to cassia, what you're talking about, Timothy was saying that he thought there was a purpose for that. Right.
Okay, gotcha. Because of the funeral symbolism in the Master Mason degree, I always suspected that the cassia was there because of its role in the Bible in embalming and with preparing dead bodies. But like I said, it's cassia in the early days, and then all of the sudden, after a certain man's stint as Grand Master, every single expose you find mentions acacia. It's like every lodge in Europe said, okay, we'll switch to acacia now. Why would they do that? And who would have the power to do that? It would have to be a grand master. Well, when I started tracing this trail, trying to figure out what is going on, why did they put acacia here? And did it have anything to do with the way Cagliostro is using it? So the man who shows up in that slot where it switches from cassia to acacia is a reverend named John Theophilus de Sagulier, who was the third Grand Master of the Premier Grand Lodge in London. Now, he's especially interesting because he was research assistant to Sir Isaac Newton in the Royal Society. The Royal Society, as we know, is the premier scientific organization. They pretty much solidified the scientific method and made science a concern for the entire world instead of a few people.
Yes, they used to be the British Royal Geography Society. And
and the Invisible College before that.
Yes,
right?
the Rosicrucians.
And so when I started looking into this, it turns out that Isaac Newton and de Sagulier were both practicing alchemists. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because when Cagliostro presents the acacia in his system, he's presenting it in an alchemical context. So I thought, maybe it's not just about masonry. Maybe this is an alchemical problem that found its way into masonry. So I started looking deeper into this, and this is what eventually gets me into John Dee and Edward Kelley, and because it's a clean transmission once you see how it happened. Well, another man in the Royal Society was this man named Elias Ashmole, who was also one of the first speculative Freemasons. Prior to that, it was an operative organization where if you belonged, you were building things. But at some point, they say, we're going to let these other gentlemen in, and those other gentlemen just happen to be these Hermetic alchemist philosopher types. We said, we'll let them in, we'll give them all of our secrets, but we won't make them actually build anything. And that's at that point when they really stop building altogether, and it's no longer a builder's guild, a stonemason's guild, it's speculative Freemasonry. Well, Ashmole was the archivist for John Dee and Edward Kelley. John Dee is who brought us Enochian magic. He was a personal astrologer to Queen Elizabeth. And he was especially interested in contacting angels, not for necessarily spiritual purposes. His model of the world, he believed that these angels had domain over certain regions on the earth. So if he could contact the angel that was over Germany, he could spy on Germany. He could have influence on Germany. And so that's how he was really approaching this. But what he was doing was trying to communicate with angels. And he couldn't do it himself. He was he had a few successes, and they were small. And he brought in these different scryers, none of which he was really ever happy with, until finally a man named Edward Kelley comes and offers to do this for him. And he's immediately successful. Now, Kelley was already kind of a charlatan-like character. His ears had been cropped for this crime called coining, which was an alchemical crime. It was adulterating metals, gold and silver, with base metals and passing them off as gold or silver. So he was already into alchemy and kind of known as a shyster. But he comes to Dee and he says, well, I can do this for you. And he's immediately successful. And it's these seances that produce the Enochian magic that we know today, those texts. Well, eventually, we find out that Kelley didn't just come to Dee to help him. Kelley claimed to have been in possession of this alchemical manuscript called the Book of Dunstan that he had gotten from the grave of Saint Dunstan in Glastonbury. And he also had this red powder that was found along with it. We don't know anything about this stuff. Like he barely mentions it. But Kelley tells Dee that if you can help me decipher this manuscript, it's got instructions on how to make more of this powder. And this powder, this red powder, is the true philosopher's stone.
Now, I also want to come in there and jump in on this from two perspectives, because first of all, let me just say that I love the background you're given about Dee and Kelley. John Dee and Edward Kelley, they did these incredible experiments together. We know they were successful because when England faced the threat of the Spanish Armada ships coming into the English Channel, they kept them away not once but twice. They told the soldiers to stand down, and sure enough, they were swallowed up by storms and these kind of things. Incredible things. And as people know, John Dee was the original 007, or the
right.
two balls in the cane. And
right.
you know, before we go further down that path right now, I want to bring it back to the red powder and the connections to alchemy and the philosopher's stone that was mentioned originally by Nicholas Flamel and all those writings. You know, it's interesting. When I was listening to an old lecture of Timothy Hogan's, we had this idea that when we look at that Masonic allegory that we find with Hiram Abiff, and you see Jubilah, Jubilo, and Jubilum, there's a very interesting connection to, if we're talking about the acacia awakening us and opening up spiritual centers. If you think where they're struck, you know, when you look at the end of their names, Manly P. Hall has this idea that when you look over at Jubilah, Jubilo, and Jubilum, you have a connection to Baal. But also, if we look at the ancient languages, like in the Egyptian, the vowels are hidden. And when you tone those, A, E, I, O, U, you feel certain energy systems opening up. Same with the O, think about the brow, the throat, the heart opening up at the same time. Right. If you're ritualistically using acacia, you could be opening up doors to other places. And again, that's something that we'll be talking about with the Neoplatonists. I'm excited to get into that with you. Absolutely. But with John Dee,
ties in too.
Yeah, it all ties into our conversation. But with John Dee and Edward Kelley, the exciting part about that and this red powder, of course, we go back to the idea of the red lion. And in certain alchemical ideas, they're using this as a precursor, or that goes over also, like we would say, this green emerald material and this white powder that has often been referred to, that we look at. Is it possible, though, I want to ask you this, is it possible that we look at alchemy in so many different levels, as it is a precursor to chemistry and science that we have today, that it's not only about the transmutation of base metals, but it's also about looking at how you could extract psychedelic substances and compounds, but also that there could be these mineral substances in nature that could upgrade the body, that it could be all of the above? Because I'm sure since you've come out with your theories, alchemically stone, that there have been people saying that there is more of a traditional alchemical stance, and there's others that side in either way. Where do you see that coming into the picture?
Well, you're right. There are several traditions. And originally I presented this particular research as saying, now this isn't all alchemy. This is one tradition within alchemy. But at this point, after learning what I've learned about Zosimos of Panopolis and his teacher, Maria Prophetissima, I'm convinced at this point that the metallurgy in the beginning was a blind, and Zosimos said as much. I had never read that portion when I wrote my book, or I would have that seals the deal. But he says to his student, Theosabia, in no uncertain terms, he says, when we talk about cinnabar, we're actually talking about acacia, and we conceal the operation under an operation whose processes are similar to this one, so that we can prevent the uninitiated from getting access to it. So he says, every time I say cinnabar in these alchemy texts I'm giving you, I'm talking about acacia. And if you read his book on, it's not the Book of Pictures, it's the Key. The title is The Key something. I mean, he must mention cinnabar 1,000 times in there. But he says plainly that it's acacia. Edward Kelley, this red powder he had, he never says it's acacia. We don't ever get that from him. We just know he had it and he was talking to angels. And that's important because, well, the reason we got into this in the first place was because of Desaguliers. And I'll run up to that real fast. So Ashmole, that early Freemason, was John Dee's archivist. He was the first person to inherit these papers on Enochian magic. He deciphers the work, starts putting it into practice, and he mentions that he was able to get a few bumps in the night kind of things, but he couldn't contact any angels. And he realizes that it must have been that powder that towards the end of their meeting, he was so anxious to get more made of, because Ashmole, being the scientific mind that he is, he thinks, well, if it's predicated on that powder, it must be a drug and he must need more of it. This is where it gets really fascinating. He comes to Robert Boyle of the Royal Society, the first chemist, and tells him, so I'm got these papers, there's missing this red powder, I think it's a drug. And he says, well, that's interesting. I've been researching this guy, Wenzel Saylor, another alchemist who claimed to have had a red powder. And St. George Ash sent me a letter and said he got that powder from Edward Kelley in Prague. So they're like, well, it's the same powder. Well, let's investigate it. And at this point, Boyle issues what you can get online, look at it, Boyle's wish list, and it's on the Royal Society's website. They put it on display in 2010. But in it, it's a list of all these things he wants to acquire for this new society to study. In it, he says he wants potent drugs that cause dreams, potent drugs that cause superhuman strength. He's looking for the Egyptian electuaries, which Chris Bennett interprets as the cannabis hashish electuaries, like Dawa Mesk and Majun. He says the fungus mentioned by the French author. Again, Bennett suspects this is mentioned by Rabelais when he's talking about an agaric mushroom and what appears to be a psychedelic context. So they're looking for psychedelics. Now, this is the scene that de Sagulier is coming out of when he becomes Grand Master and puts acacia there. So I'm beating my head against the wall saying they're looking for drugs, but where did they find the acacia? Where did this come from? Well, another among their interests was cartography, proper maps of the world.
Yes.
And among their papers were Christopher Columbus's papers from his voyage to South America, the second voyage, the one where he encountered the Indians blowing a red powder up one another's nostrils with a tube that was hollowed out, this substance called yopo or epina. Now, they don't name it. Christopher Columbus doesn't name it as an acacia tree, but by the time A. von Humboldt, the explorer von Humboldt, got there and observed its use among the natives, he identified the tree as Acacia neopo. And the tree is actually an Anadenanthera colubrina, but it's a mimosoid and it looks just like an acacia. If you're not a botanist, you wouldn't know the difference.
Everything you're saying also adds up, because when we go back to Prague, which is one of my favorite esoteric, occult, alchemical cities in Europe by far, you go there, it's beautiful. You look at the architectonics, how the buildings are structured. But most importantly, when we had guys like John Dee and Edward Kelley hanging out there, that was during the time of Rudolph II. And right. When Rudolph II was there on behalf of the Habsburgs, he had the Golden Lane, the powder towers. He was obsessed with botany and rare botanical specimens, all kinds of strange magical formulas. He brought the best of alchemists and occultists there because he believed somehow that this would ward off the invaders of the Ottoman Empire, where he was on the Vltava River, which connects up to the Danube. So
Kelley was his alchemist, his private alchemist.
Yeah, absolutely. When you go into his castle up there, which I urge everyone to do, if you go into those parts, go up there. He's got this art where all his art shows this erotic stuff, the scenes and all kinds of alchemical vats filled with white powders, and it's an incredible thing. You see him made of all these pieces of fruit, like he's on a psychedelic trip. He's got clocks and strange astronomical ideas. But I want to talk to you about psilocybin mushrooms, because you and I were talking about it the other night, that there is a connection to DMT.
So there are many different kinds of psychedelic mushrooms, but the ones we're talking about are psilocybin mushrooms. And psilocybin is similar to DMT in that it works on the 5-HT2A receptor in the brain, the same thing that I believe LSD and mescaline also work on. And what psilocybin is chemically is 4-phosphoryloxy N,N-dimethyltryptamine. So it's basically nature's orally active form of DMT that doesn't necessitate an MAOI. You can just take it. Now, an MAOI, even if you didn't combine it with DMT, as we said in regard to psychiatry, it's psychoactive. It is a drug. It will change your state of consciousness on its own. So that being said, a psilocybin experience is very different than an ayahuasca experience, but they're still very similar.
When we look at how psilocybin fits into the mysteries, we find not only these depictions over in Egypt, as I was telling you, but when we look up, let's say, even in Transylvania, in the Carpathian Mountains up there in Buceci, next to what some have called the Transylvanian Sphinx, there are these mushroom-like structures. And this incredible fungus we know that grows underground in these large areas with mycelium, it's everywhere, right. It's all around us. But we know that when we look back at the likes of Terence McKenna, he had theories that he was sharing that he believed that it came from out in space due to how the spores could survive out there, that it's very alien to our planet when we look at psilocybin. There's no doubt a connection not only with Wasson that he's brought out, with that he introduced to America within these traditions over in Mexico and various cultures. McKenna always said that that was the one thing we had in common with the Maya. I think that mushrooms in general are amazing. And I'd love to share with everybody that since I got back from my last trip to Europe, I was doing very, very poorly with my jet lag this time. And it was a real struggle to get back to normal with my circadian rhythms over here. And I was trying coffee, I was trying everything. And the one thing that saved me was using even functional mushrooms. And the last little while I've been using the likes of lion's mane. This is a great brand. I'm just going to give it a shout out. It's called Neuro Buddha, but lion's mane, I was using cordyceps, which I've continued using these every day. And you can get great sleep, and there's so many great effects that you find with reishi or chaga for your immune system. And there's other great mushrooms like turkey tail and a cornucopia of benefits we get from them, but there's no denying how amazing psilocybin is. And I'll share something with you and the viewers at home that I was told not too long ago by a fellow that's been involved in the intelligence world. He's sort of retired these days, and he was involved with what some would call unacknowledged or special access programs. And that's the sort of stuff that looks at the investigation of UAPs and UFOs and strange stuff like that. And he would also tell me about the sort of experiments you'd get by Dr. Hal Puthoff over at SRI. We know the government was experimenting with remote viewing and all kinds of stuff in the 70s. They had documents on looking at how to weaponize astral projection and stuff like that. Very strange stuff. But he was telling me in the likes that there's papers that existed on psilocybin mushrooms in particular, on how they believe that it came from another galaxy and that it opened up other faculties of perception. We know that right now we're only perceiving a very narrow light band of frequency. And right. we also know that, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that exists out in the infrared and ultraviolet, and we are experimenting right now, Daniel. I don't know if you know this, but we're experimenting with injecting mice in their eyes with nanoparticles so they can see into the infrared and other spectrums. And that's coming over to humans. You know, they're repopulating the optic nerve, doing stuff in the lungs, wow. So you can breathe underwater longer. So there is going to come a time when we can see that we are literally sharing our environment with all sorts of different multi-dimensional intelligences and even astral wildlife even. And I'm reminded back when we go back to Crowley, who I know Chris Bennett is very fond of. He's got different sculptures of him and written about him extensively. That Crowley himself, when he has this portrayal of Lamb, one of the things that Lamb says, who looks very much like a gray ET, and other people argue about the significance of Lamb symbolically and everything like that. But Lamb says, today you call us angels and demons, tomorrow you'll call us something else. Well, what we see again when you talk about Goetia, which is very interesting, when we go back into these traditions and these writings, and very fascinating what you're talking about, what they're perceiving in those folks. I'm reminded of the Eastern theosophical idea of when you're being born here, that your soul is generating your personality, your ego, your emotional body, your mental body, and around you there's these bands of consciousness that you're generating, and it's sort of like the circle that the magus stands inside of. It's that how space-time can be bent, warped, and twisted, how we open up wormholes, and how there's a perception there. And I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about these substances being used that are opening up these faculties of perception, would you be able to tell us about the Theosophical Society, what they were able to perceive when they started experimenting with these sort of substances? And is it not true that they saw ascended masters and more?
Oh yeah, there's lots of accounts of visions with the Theosophical Society. The most obvious being Colonel Alcott's account when he first met these masters. He actually lived in an apartment building just above Blavatsky, and Hilarion knocks on his door, and he opens the door, and there he's standing with his turban on, and he says, you know, we're these masters that have been communicating with you. And he starts to panic. He says, well, you must let me go and get Madam. She will want to talk to you. And they say, no, wait a minute, we'll talk for a moment. And they take cigars out of their pocket, and they hand him one, and they light one, and he notes that his is moist, it's wet. And when he's smoking it, he says it causes, then all of a sudden it starts raining in his room. And then he's looking at them, trying to figure out what's going on, and they're just kind of smiling at him. And then they make bouquets of flowers appear in the room. And then all of a sudden the room disappears, and he's in a cube of space that disappears, and it's replaced by this landscape. And he says for an entire hour, he forgot where he was, what he was doing. And then when he finally came to, they were gone. And he runs out his door to go tell Madam, you know, that they were here. And he gets there, and they're already sitting down there having tea with her. You know, so it looks almost like there's no telling what's going on in that scenario. But if they had slipped him a sort of Mickey or something, as you'd call it, if you did put DMT in a cigar, it melts. It would melt the minute you lit it. So I don't know what the case was with that. But as far as portals in the sky, sky gates, stargates, you know, eventually Blavatsky finally did cave in and said, okay, we'll go ahead and do this esoteric inner order thing. We don't know exactly what happened, because not a single person who participated in that wrote it down. They kept to their deal and were silent about it through their entire life. But we do know that that room was equipped with a window in the ceiling, what in Masonry they call a dormer window. And we don't know what they were looking at through that window, but we do know that she was very, if you read for example, in the introduction to, it might be the first chapter, to Isis Unveiled, she goes on and on about Plato and how Plato was superior to Aristotle, and how this model of an intelligible and a sensible, this is what we have to go back to.
The Platonic solids.
Platonic solids, which is, you know, what he says, the demiurge used to construct this entire realm. I don't know if you've seen Randall Carlson's lecture on
Brilliant.
mathematics in the world, but
absolutely brilliant. And I believe everything that you're saying is correct. You know, Plato, he had definitely cracked one of the greatest secrets, is that you can change all the life forms that generate from a form once you change a shape on a solid, or what gets generated from that. That's one of the great secrets. God geometrizes continually. And
right.
Back to what you were saying, I started to think about a tesseract cube when you were talking about this cube opening up, and how profound that is, what you were saying. And before we leave that subject about Blavatsky and her meetings with these ascended masters and who she had met as well, wasn't it Guy Ballard, I think in 1934, that mentioned a meeting with Saint Germain? And we have I want to say,
know this.
What's that?
I don't know this.
It was the I Am movement, and there's been other incredible meetings. So there's no doubt a way of opening up this perception and these faculties. I mean, how often have we heard people on DMT talk about their experiences with machine elves and other intelligences that are communicating with them in the multiverse?
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And Plato, if you read in one of his most famous books, The Republic, that's where he presents his famous myth of where he presents his model of the afterworld with these portals, afterlife, where the soul enters the world or leaves the world.
That's the first great, this is the first great NDE story, everyone, with this soldier that goes there, he crosses a rainbow bridge, he reviews his life. I mean, I don't think it's so much an allegory. I think he's laying it out for us exactly the way it is.
It's pretty phenomenal reading it. And he says it really happened to this man. He was a soldier wounded in war, and they put him on this funeral pyre. And after 12 days, just before they lit it, he got up and started talking. But he described this experience, like you said, of going through planetary heavens and acquiring a daemon and being reborn, and a daemon being like almost like we would think of a guardian angel that comes with you through your whole life, that accompanies you. He describes all of that. And Porphyry, he's a Neoplatonist, part of what you would call the third wave of Platonists. He wrote an esoteric commentary on Homer's Odyssey about this cave that Homer found. And this really figures into my new book on Homer and the Heart of Theurgy. But in this cave, it had two entrances. And Homer says that through one entrances, immortals could enter, and through the other, men could enter. And Porphyry explains this. He's basing it on Pythagoras, and he's basing it on ancient Egyptian teachings. And if you want the Egyptian quotes later on, I can pull them out and we can go over those. But he says that all souls prior to and after a round of incarnation circle the Milky Way. They orbit this Milky Way. Well, and Plato describes this too. He says that the Milky Way intersects with the zodiac wheel, and this causes an X of two circles, two spinning circles. So when a soul incarnates and they leave the Milky Way intersects the zodiac circle at 2 points. Porphyry says that these points are the gate of the moon, which is Cancer, which is ruled by the moon, and then the gate of Saturn, which is in Capricorn, which Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. So he says that a soul, if we imagine the wheel, the zodiac wheel like this, and we have Cancer at the top and Capricorn at the bottom, well, the soul enters Cancer and then has to go down one side. So they go through all the signs on this arc of the zodiac before they come out of the Saturn gate, and now they're in a flesh and blood fetus. They're a human. They're in a body. And when they die, or conversely, when you leave your body or do DMT or do theurgy, it causes you to re-enter that Saturn gate and travel up the opposite curve of the zodiac wheel and come back out the gate of the moon. And then you're in the realm of immortals, of the gods, where all the souls are circling. And this is what he says happens to every person. Now, what really fascinated me about this and ties into what we're talking about with DMT is Graham Hancock, when he was down in Moundville, Alabama, which is about 2 hours from me. There are these mounds there that belong to a group of natives that are unique. They're not like the other groups of natives. They did things differently. And they built these truncated pyramid style mounds. And we have one here in Mississippi, which is where we do our private initiation and ritual work. It's called Owl Creek Mound. And it's a truncated pyramid with a crescent mound over to the west. Well, Graham finds out that, standing on these mounds at the winter solstice facing west, you can see Orion descend on the horizon. And that's where the portal is, according to this Moundville group. They say it's in the Orion Nebula, which is just below the 3 stars in Orion's belt. they had all these artifacts they found there, which are these large discs, and on them is a hand with an eye in the center, just like you would see in a Hamsa hand or palmistry symbols. But this is in Alabama, natives in Alabama. And according to their system of astrology, this is Orion. The wrist on this hand is actually the belt and on Orion constellation, and the skirt and feet are what come down as the hand. And that eye is that portal. And so they'll watch for that eye to get right on the edge, and they will thrust themselves into it and enter this portal.
I find that really fascinating, because if you take out some tarot cards and try to take some that are based on the Arthur Waite editions that that came out of the Golden Dawn and everything, there's been so many different versions that we can look at that are like that. But if you take out the Hierophant card and look on the front of the Hierophant card, if you look at the bottom, there's a set of 2 keys. And those 2 keys that you see, that you're going to see everywhere at the Vatican. A lot of people don't know what that symbol is in relation to the pontiff, but it's actually a point of fact called the Pontifex. And that cross key, what it is, it represents the celestial doorway in our galaxy, in those areas of the precession of the equinoxes and when things line up. And it shows that the Pope, who is the solar ruler of this particular cycle, that's why he's wearing the fish hat or the meter of Dagon and all this sort of symbolism that he's carrying right there. He's the ruler of the age of Pisces on that celestial doorway. And to make another point to absolutely validate everything that you said, when we go back into the teachings of Pythagoras, as you know, who was schooled in the teachings of Egypt and Babylon and all these sort of areas, that he knew that when we look at transmigration, reincarnation, all these sort of theories, that it was an untenable concept to say that, hey, you're going to go backwards in your incarnation. You're going to go into a housefly if you've been wrong. You're going to go into an animal or whatever it is. That this was actually talking about being born under that sign of the zodiac and how that was coming together. You told me something the other day on the phone when we were discussing this about these sheaths that coming down this almost like a portal or a passageway, and very much what you've been saying so far, and how this is an alignment or an attunement for the soul vehicle or the soul body, correct?
Vehicle, yeah, the soul vehicle, what's called the okima in Greek philosophy and Platonism. They say that once the soul enters that gate and it descends through each of those signs impart to it of a tunic, a coat, and this is where we get our idea for, or at least a continuation of the idea of 7 souls or 7 bodies. There's 7 envelopes that each correspond to, they have 2 parts, they're polar, but each one pertains to, if we're talking about Venus, for instance, it pertains to both lust and charity or agape. It's the vice and the virtue that you acquire.
Yeah, and we see, absolutely. And we see this in the mysteries. We see this in the Rosicrucian traditions. This is the golden wedding garment of Christ. You see this over in our ancient depictions as the robes of righteousness that the priests wore. It is, the soul is mentioned in so many different depictions, and the soul is really the God that our mind and our emotions bow before. It's generating that
the coat of many colors that our Father knit for us.
Right? Exactly. And the Egyptians had this understood perfectly. They talked about the Ba, the Ka, and the Ak, and that's actually one of the things I want to ask you about next. This is really fascinating when you go into this, because a lot of people have seen this depiction about what they call the Merkabah. And of course, those are Egyptian terms, the Ka, the Ba, the Ak, and the Ba, which the Egyptians showed going through portals and doorways. It's often depicted as a stork. And it's very interesting that growing up,
with the face of the deceased.
Yeah, we often, well, remember we were growing up and we would say, well, where do babies come from? And all the old cartoons in the 80s and 70s and stuff showed a stork that was coming and delivering it. This is a very old depiction back in Egypt and Greece and those sort of places. But with this, the myrrh, which we have multiple definitions, but let's just call it light. this light vehicle, the Ka, the Ba, and the Ak. We see that this teaching was brought out years ago by, there was a gentleman that was named Drunvalo Melchizedek, and he was talking all about these teachings and how you could do a meditation, a Merkabah meditation, and see a triangular formation spinning above you, one spinning below you, and the other way, and how you could use this for the expansion of your consciousness. What do you have to say about that being a vehicle of sorts?
Well, the Merkabah, that goes back to Kabbalah, Judaism. It's actually pre-Kabbalistic, and they get it from Ezekiel's vision, when Ezekiel sees the beast with four faces, and in the center of this is a thrown chariot, and it's surrounded by wheels within wheels. What he's actually describing is the solar system. Wheels within wheels are planets within their orbits, and those four faces are what we call the four fixed signs of the zodiac, the four signs that it makes a cross whenever the sun on the vernal equinox, it rises in any one of those four signs. But those four faces represent those four signs, and the throne chariot in the center. The chariot, ever since ancient Sumeria, has been the province of Utu Shamesh, who is the sun god. It's the sun god that travels in a chariot. So to place the chariot at the center of this formation is almost like almost presages heliocentrism in a way, but we'll leave that for another discussion.
But let me ask you this.
My point though is it's a soul. He's describing the solar system because man is a microcosm.
Yes.
And he's saying your solar vehicle, the Okima, the Merkabah, that transports your soul around and in and out of material barriers.
I love where you're going with that. I love where you're going with that. And I would say to that, I don't disagree with you, but Blavatsky told us that we had the keys to the mysteries, which was that the lock had to be turned 7 times, that we could have something that would be autobiographical, something that's geographical, something that could be, theogonic, or having these various connections to astronomy and alchemy. What if it is both, not only just what you're describing, but also could be a physical apparition or some other sort of device or vehicle? Because we also find that in that description that it talks about it being made of some sort of color that's like lapis lazuli, and there's thousands of little eyes on it, which some have said, hey, could these have been like little lights? And then when the Lord
can be a thing,
it could be, exactly.
That can exist here has its prototype in the intelligible.
Exactly.
That's Plato 101.
Exactly, my friend.
Right.
And then when the Lord steps out, these beings that are bipedal. One of the interesting parts of that story is then he sits in the commander chair. He goes in there and sits in and flies off over to some mountain at the top and starts checking out this very interesting place. I love that when we read the Bible with this knowledge that you're describing and this symbolism, we start to see that a lot of the actual is hidden in the literal. We have keys to astrotheology in there. We have so much incredible symbolism for those with eyes to see. And I think you're exactly right with what you're saying and how that ties into the galaxy and the solar system.
Keys. You just said keys again, and that reminded me what you said about the keys on the Hierophant card. Number one, the first thing I thought was 2 keys, right?
Yes.
2 gates. Why 2 keys? Unless there's 2 keys, 2 gates. But my other thought was when Porphyry places these 2 gates in Cancer and Capricorn, it's actually a subtle blind, because he's using something called the Thema Mundi, which, shout out to my pal Jamie Paul Lamb for exposing me to this. But it's a teaching device that has the placement of the planets in a certain way that are impossible because of how close Mercury and Venus are to the sun. It's just used to teach students of astrology planetary aspects, domicile rulerships, things like that. But if you tweak where the gates actually are to this system, they end up in Cancer and Capricorn. But if you don't use that system, you look at where they actually are in the sky, they're in Taurus and in the space between Scorpio and Sagittarius.
Yeah, the
And those are two of our what? Those are two of those faces on that four-faced beast. One of those gates is in Taurus, and that's the if you look at the Golden Dawn, the way they organize the cards, each card corresponds to either a planet, an element, or a zodiac sign. The Hierophant or the Pope corresponds to Taurus. And that's where you're saying those keys are. So that hit me when you said that a second ago. That's very symmetrical. And my big thing that I love about the tarot is the Fool card. And it ties into what we're talking about too, because if you look up at Orion, you see a being, a figure of a person, and behind him trailing is Canis, the Canis constellation, a dog. And on the Fool card, what do we have following the Fool but this dog nipping at his heels? So I've always thought, is that, should we be looking here? But now, since we're back on Orion,
I like that. That was
Graham
good.
Hancock, these Moundville natives, they have this system, Orion Nebula, winter solstice, face west, stand on the mound. Well, he said when he visited the Amazon and encountered the ayahuasqueros there, the shaman who are administering the ayahuasca to people coming to take it, they told him about an identical model, that they enter this portal in the Orion Nebula, only they don't wait to do it on the winter solstice. They do it, they say, every time they drink ayahuasca. So it's uncanny, the similarities that you run into. And it really starts to look like, and this is what they call it, the tribes that use it, they call it ayahuasca. Ayahuasca means vine of the souls or vine of the dead.
And it's interesting because
climbing this vine.
When I was in Egypt recently with Timothy Hogan, we talked about you. We brought you up a few times.
Oh no.
Yeah, no, it was all good. It was all good stuff. But he said, don't you think it's interesting, Johnny? We were over in Abydos and a few places, that when you look over at, let's say, a priest on the wall where you see the original Masonic apron, and when we look over there, you see Wet-Wawat at the end, clearing the energy. But he says, don't you think it's interesting that not only is it in the shape of Orion, the priest, but also a DMT molecule? And he says, we're referring over to your work, P.D. Newman. And
that's R.N. Voigt. R.N. Voigt, shout out to Voigt. He's the one that discovered the similarity of those two images.
Isn't it amazing?
It's Spirit in the Sky.
The Egyptians, they had it all figured out a long time ago. When you look at Nut, the sky goddess, and how it's the Milky Way, there was no doubt keys to all this and how they understood how to travel to these places and where to go. The alignments that we see over on the Giza Plateau and other places with Orion, with Sirius, and many
of these similarities. Yeah, and they couldn't have known that molecular shape. There's no way they could have known the molecular shape. So that says to me the fact that Orion is intimately connected to this acacia mystery and the Orion mystery. All this stuff's connected, and here the molecule is the same shape. That's evidence of a creator for me. That's evidence of this being a theophany, that everything here, if we're open enough to it, is a symbolic communication of the mind of what organized this.
And when you look at what they were saying in The Secret Doctrine, if you look at the work of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the Theosophists, that once we look at religion, for example, and you get past all the superficial differences with all the silly stuff you find with denominations and dogma that people argue over, that have been used for politics and all that, there are esoteric teachings found within. The same with our secret societies and esoteric work. I don't care if we're talking about Masonry, if we're talking about Rosicrucians, we're talking about any of these orders, Golden Dawn, magical traditions, all of them have keys, the keys to the mysteries, if you have eyes to see. And we start to see that there's a very ancient pattern. And I believe that the work that you're doing is extremely valuable. And I can definitely see where your photographic memory has come into place, because you and Chris Bennett, you guys are incredible, firing off rapid names of authors and studies and citations. It's truly amazing. It's like witnessing Encyclopedia Britannica come to life. But I want to say, Daniel, within our fascinating conversation that we had today, you've definitely given everyone a lot to think about. And if they want to find more of your work, where can they do that? How do they get your books, and where do they find your website?
My first book, Alchemically Stoned is available with the publisher, which was Laudable Pursuit. But you can also get it on Amazon. It's available at every major bookseller. My second book, Alchemically Stoned, which looks at this problem not just from a Masonic context, but globally in an alchemical context. It's already out with Tria Prima, and it's available on their website. My new book comes out with Inner Traditions. We don't have a release date yet, but the title we think is going to be the title is Homer and the Heart of Theurgy, Foreshadowings of a Ritual Tradition. And I'm really excited about that one because, like you said, you encounter theurgy in the magical literature, but rarely do you get, I don't know of any examples where you get step-by-step explanation of what they were doing in and around the 2nd century after Christ. What is this ritual that they're all doing that separates the soul from the body? And that I was really fortunate to be able to offer that in this book. So I'm really excited about it.
And as I was telling you,
up with my talks, lectures, and things, I have a Facebook page, an author page, and I'll post this there. Any of my interviews or links to where you can buy tickets or just come see me give a lecture.
I thank you so much for being here today and sharing with us all this incredible knowledge. I want to thank you for being here, and hopefully we can have you back again if you'll join us for another conversation.
Absolutely. We'll get into the manuscripts and how this got out of Egypt and became an alchemical thing in the first place.